Chapter 22 The Sister That You Never Had. In the blue hours of morning, the first hour when a veil of deep shade still varnishes the landscape in quiet recollection, of doves just beginning their doleful murmurs, and when the dark gray snow resembles clouds upon the winter ground, Maggie Foss stands above the sleeping figure of Emily, sprawled on the long floral sofa that decorates the downstairs library. Maggie eyes the sleeper, whose body is blanketed in wool, with an intense gaze of ineffable emotion. She kneels down, picking up a delicately embroidered pillow that has fallen onto the ground, and places it below the sleeper's head. Upstairs, in Billy's bedroom, he and Esther doze, morning light just filtering in through the lavender curtains. And Maggie knocks on the door. "Billy, wake up!" Billy rouses, startled, and sweats nervously upon hearing Maggie's voice. Esther also wakens, though only slightly. And dizzily, Billy says, "Yes, Maggie?" "I'm taking you to the market," says Maggie. "We need food. Meet me downstairs." Billy clumsily arises from the bed, most of the covers having fallen onto the floor. He quickly dresses and shoots out the door, fumbling down the staircase. Meanwhile, Esther turns over in her bed, sleeping in a while longer. In that time, the morning sky brightens, dismissing the blue gloom into pale sunlight streaking through the clouds. Having risen, Esther emerges into the hallway, her ragged dress exchanged for a flattering dark brown one that has been provided to her. White fuzz glitters in the air as Esther creeps attentively down the hall. Passing by the circular window nook on her left, she sees the back of a small, dark figure planted against the light, and stops in her tracks. Audrey? Hearing her name, Audrey whirls around, facing Esther with an expression of shock and horror. Neither move, frozen to the floor, until Audrey suddenly overcomes her paralysis and launches herself at Esther, knocking her back as she holds Esther's chest against her face. She breathes heavily and, with tears in her eyes, asks, "Are you real?" And Esther, face blank nodding, says, "Mm-hmm." Audrey pulls back, eyes wild as she glances around to confirm they're alone, and then grabs Esther's paw, rushing her down the hall and into Emily's room. She shuts the door behind them and looks to Esther with a haunted gaze. "I thought you were a ghost." "I thought you were too," says Esther. "I'm so glad you're all right." "Shh," says Audrey. "Some of the cats are still up here. What are you doing here, Esther?" "We came looking for you," Esther says. "Abigail's in the city and she's waiting to bring you home." Audrey's expression shifts and she goes silent, frightening Esther, who steps back as Audrey begins to sob, afraid that her presence has upset her. Audrey prevents her retreat, grabbing her paw again and brushing up against her. Esther is disturbed. "What's wrong, Audrey?" "I'm not allowed to leave," says Audrey. "I've tried, but they won't let me." "That doesn't sound right. Won't Emily help you?" Audrey assumes a wrathful expression when Emily is named. "I don't care about Emily. She pretends to be all kind, but she's either too much of a coward to do anything, or she's in on their whole plot to trap me here." "She didn't strike me as the deceitful sort. Admittedly, I don't know her well, but she's acquainted with Abigail and Miss Hanson." And Audrey grumbles ominously, "Yes, I know." "Have you met before?" Esther asks. Audrey turns around and grabs the tattered letter box from its place upon the dresser, its contents crudely shoved inside. She faces Esther. "No, but I've been reading her letters." Esther looks astonished. Audrey picks one out of the box and holds it up. "There's a few from Abigail," she says. "I recognized her paw writing, and they're signed anyway." "You're not ashamed?" says Esther, aghast. "That's such a breach of privacy." Ambivalently, Audrey goes on. "For one, I was bored, and I was locked in here anyway. I was only indulging myself. No one's been decent enough to tell me anything, so can you blame me for wanting to figure out what the hell's going on?" "I guess not." And presenting a letter to Esther, she says, "Here, read one." Esther blushes, raising her paws. "No, I shouldn't. I wouldn't learn anything helpful anyway." Audrey returns the letter to its box. "Suit yourself. But it's very damning. For one, she's got kits somewhere, but all the ladies call her Miss, so God knows what she did with them. And it doesn't seem like Abigail has written her recently. At least, not in this box, 'cause she never mentions me and the paper smells old. Esther is dubious. I don't think we should jump to conclusions just yet. She seemed nice to me. She gave me new bandages and... Esther stops herself, realizing she has touched a subject. Audrey's ears swivel uncomfortably as she subtly inspects Esther's injuries. Esther shrinks back, avoiding Audrey's gaze, and snivels, tears coming in. She attempts to hide her face, but Audrey steps toward her, her expression dull as she pulls an arm around Esther's shoulder and pulls her close. Aren't you angry with me? Esther sobs. And Audrey, genuinely confused, asks, Why? Esther shivers. If it weren't for me, Louise would still... It's my fault. And restrained, Audrey pats her on the back. No, you haven't done anything wrong. You're just as helpless as the rest of us. She made her own choices. It wasn't your responsibility to stop her. Esther cries a while longer, and Audrey kisses her cheek, where for cats, kissing is licking. Consoled enough to speak again, Esther goes on. I know you're right, but I can't help how I feel. Everyone wishes Louise was here instead of me, and I miss her so much. I know we weren't as close. She took care of me when I was too afraid to move, and I've gotten you into so much trouble too. Why did you run away, Audrey? All that time waiting, I felt like my stomach was turning inside out, that I'd hear you were dead or lost or taken away somewhere because of what I did. I didn't mean to disappear, says Audrey. I only wanted to get away for a little while and come back on my own when it suited me, just to prove that I control my own life with what power I do have. At least then I had a sliver of control. But I'm stuck here because I saw them kill someone, and they're afraid if they let me out, I'll tell. Kill someone, says Esther. That certainly changes things. But are you sure? I thought I was. I don't know. I don't think I'm crazy. Even if I am wrong, I'm sick of this place, and if you think you can get me out, I'll go. Well, I'll try my best, Esther says. If Emily's a good cat, I'm sure she'll agree to let you go now that Abigail's come. And after a pause, Audrey says, What about you, Esther? Are you coming back to Chamberfield? I guess so, she says, blushing. I don't know where I'll go after that, though. I'll figure something out. But I can't lose you, too, Audrey says, determined. We're all we have left after this. You're a part of me. How could I live without you? Defeatedly, Esther says, I don't want to go, but there's nothing I can do about it. You shouldn't worry what happens to me. I'll have to take care of myself. I'm more worried about you. Are you sure you're okay? Louise was your litter mate. I'm fine, says Audrey seriously. Of course I miss her. I'm not a monster. But I hate the way I feel when I'm thinking about her, so let's not talk about it anymore. Audrey, you have to let yourself grieve. If you don't, then... Look, and she's lashing her tail, let's just focus on getting out of here first. I don't have a plan, but we can probably sneak out now while the others are asleep, or tonight if you need to rest. The cats here will probably make me leave today anyway. I can go back to Miss Hanson's house and tell them to come get you. The floor suddenly creaks from an unseen source, and Audrey anxiously juts her head around, hushing Esther. Quiet! They'll hear us. The girls go silent as paw steps sound across the hall, but they continue past their door and down the staircase. Audrey stands protectively around Esther, the fur on her back and tail spiked up. As the sounds recede, Audrey grits her teeth. I'll make them sorry if they touch even a whisker on you. Esther gazes thoughtfully at the door, while Audrey continues her prickling. After some moments in silence, Esther steps forward and cautiously cracks open the door, peeping her head into the hall. Baffled, Audrey watches her until Esther steps out. Audrey shoots forward and says, What are you doing? And Esther, turning her head across her shoulder, says, I'll be back. Esther leaves the door slightly ajar and makes her way down the hall. Downstairs, Florence sits at a small glass table in the parlor, wearing her reading glasses and drinking a mug of coffee as she turns the pages of a large book. Her hedgehog lays sprawled on the carpet. When Esther steps off the staircase, Florence addresses her, eyes still glued to her reading. Maud, you haven't seen my... Oh, you're not Maud. Esther bows slightly, still rooted to the stairs. Good morning, ma'am. Are you Mrs. O'Leary? And Florence, putting the book away. Sure am. Do you know what you're doing with yourself, lass? Yes, ma'am. I'll go whenever it suits you. Sipping the coffee, she says. You could do me a favor. Get Maud up and tell her I said to be ready by the hour. I don't want to miss our train on account of her slothful morning routine. Esther nods. I will, ma'am. She flies back up the staircase and follows the sound of snoring to Maud's door, and knocking says, Miss Maud, are you awake? From inside she hears, Gugh, I will. Esther pushes the door open, finding Maud buried in the covers of her bed. The room is decorated with little paper ducks, candles, and soaps. Esther says, Mrs. O'Leary wants you downstairs. And Maud, reluctantly sitting up, eyes tired, Mrs. O'Leary can have the sharp end of my paw. Recognizing Esther, Oh, look how pretty you are, Mousie. You look like a miniature Billy. And grabbing a comb at the bedside and ungracefully grooming her ears, Tell my sister I'll be down in a minute. Esther nods warily, then ducks out of the room, returning to the parlor. She sits in one of the pretty fabric chairs, and eventually Maud canters down. Florence, sitting up from her chair, flings a bag around her shoulder. Well, let's not be wasting daylight. You, lass, do as Emily tells you. Emily's not coming. And Florence, putting her paw on the doorknob, She needs rest. You could do well to keep your voice down, Maud. And Maud, following Florence out the door, I will do no such thing. This is our house, and I have every right to exercise the full extent of my vocal cords. Maud shuts the door behind her, leaving the house eerily quiet. After a moment's pause, Esther scurries back upstairs and into Emily's room, where Audrey is sitting on the bed. They've gone now, she says. Come with me and we'll get out before Emily wakes up. Ears pricking, Audrey hops off the bed on all fours and follows Esther downstairs into the parlor. Before they can get to the door, a weak voice calls out, Esther? Startled, Esther stops in her tracks and turns her head around. Audrey stands impatiently at the door, but Esther meekly obeys, standing in the doorway to the library, where she sees Emily lying on the sofa. And slowly sitting up, Emily says, Did you sleep well? Do you feel any better? Yes, says Esther. I think I might be able to stand now, and my ear doesn't hurt as much anymore. That's a relief, says Emily. I'd like to keep an eye on your leg a little longer, just to make sure the wound is healing properly, unless you need to leave now. I don't mind. Thank you, miss. Standing up, rubbing her eyes, Emily says, I'll change out the bandages again. Esther follows her to the staircase and spots Audrey crouching behind the parlor wall. Esther motions her head as if to say, Go on, get out of here, and continues up the stairs with Emily. However, Audrey stays put, primarily because she will not leave without Esther, but also because Esther has not told her where Abigail is. She steps out from behind the wall as Emily and Esther disappear upstairs, then skitters into the library to sit at the window seat, looking out onto the road in the hypnotic manner that cats often do. Her tail swishes and teeth chatter as small passerine birds flutter in bushes outside. When Emily and Esther return, Audrey leaves the library to confront them. I'm thirsty. Is there anything to drink? Mildly startled, Emily says, Help yourself to whatever is in the fridge. Or there's tea if you prefer. Esther follows Audrey into the kitchen while Emily watches from afar. Opening the icebox, Audrey takes a glass jug full of milk and pours a serving into the kettle, then lights the stove to heat it. Meanwhile, Esther gets herself a glass of orange juice. As Audrey heats the milk, Emily walks over and stands behind her. Be careful not to let it boil, or it'll curdle. I know that, says Audrey. Audrey takes the kettle and swishes it around to prevent the milk from boiling, because she knows how things ought to be done. Emily retreats to the parlor with Esther, and they take a seat by the fireplace, which isn't burning. Satisfied with the kettle, Audrey brings her mug of warm milk over and sits away from them. Noticeably fatigued, Emily says, I thought we might go downtown today. If you'd like, there's a few bakeries worth trying, and I can take you anywhere else you'd like to go. Esther shoots an inquisitive glance at Audrey, who puts down her milk. Indeterminably, she says, "Okay, that's fine." Emily looks mildly uncomfortable, as if she had expected a different response. "You can come along too, Esther, if you feel well enough." And Esther, a well-adjusted individual, all things considered, says, "I'd love to." Emily stands up. "All right. It'll be a bit chilly, so I'll find you a coat. Audrey, you put yours on too." As Emily departs down the hall, Audrey blinks. Then she exits the parlor to retrieve her coat upstairs. Sometime later, a thick mist... Hold on, I have to pause. Sometime later, a thick mist has rolled in over the city, and, though it doesn't snow, little can be seen beyond the white haze that floats upon the cobbles, desaturating the red buildings. Nevertheless, hand-drawn carriages and automobiles plow through the matrix of white streets. Within a quiet nook among the buildings, a wide footpath ends in a cul-de-sac, flanked on each side by quaint storefronts, selling various trinkets, hats, and hot meals, an empty fountain marking the center. In a small bakery behind the fountain, Esther, wearing an oversized felt coat and a bonnet that hides her ears, sits with Audrey at a square table. Audrey bites at a gooey chocolate chunk cookie, which she is perfectly allowed to do, the melted chocolate getting on her paws. Esther has a modest slice of lemon cake, which she eats in silence. The pastry choices don't have any particular meaning. Emily sits a little ways away by the cloudy window, drinking a mug of hot coffee while her eyes shift from the kittens to the street outside. Few other cats populate the building. Unsure of what to do after having finished her snack, Audrey eyes Emily warily, who stares out her window. Esther admires the roof, earning her the title of roof admirer. And quietly to Esther, Audrey says, "Tell her we're done." Esther, moderately confused, says, "She still has her coffee." Audrey sticks her tongue out sourly. After a moment, Esther stands up begrudgingly and bows slightly while approaching Emily. "Thank you for taking us here, miss." And Emily turns to face Esther. "Would you like anything else?" Esther is bashful. "No, there's no need." Emily quickly finishes the last of her coffee and says, "We can take a look at some of those stores if you'd like." "It's up to you. I haven't any money. But you'll want a few things for yourself, and I don't suppose you'll get any living in an orphanage." "Thank you, miss." And Emily stands up. "Ready, Audrey?" Audrey doesn't reply, but she makes eye contact, slowly slinking out of her chair. Emily, face betraying nothing, takes the reluctant Audrey's paw and leads their group out into the foggy courtyard. Emily keeps hold of Audrey's paw, and they float into a clothing store adjacent to the bakery, passing through aisles of stylishly decked mannequins displaying fine suits, hats, and dresses. Esther prods at a display of costume jewelry, while Emily and Audrey stand around awkwardly, not engaging with capitalism. As they make their way through the store, Esther passes by a display of winter wear. Her eyes pass over a flattering lavender coat with a matching cap and boots in white trim. Returning to the foggy streets, Esther is wearing her new outfit, looking incredibly pleased with herself, purring, if you will. Emily says, with her now habitual slight discomfort, "Can I take you anywhere, Audrey?" Esther shoots an intense gaze toward Audrey, as if to say, "Hey, here's your chance, she's trying to help you." Audrey scrunches her shoulders, hiding her face in her scarf like a turtle or tortoise. "Where were you when you saw your parents last? Were you separated from them?" says Emily. Audrey continues to invoke her Fifth Amendment right, making Esther somewhat irritated and Emily progressively sad. Esther looks around the streets. "Is there anywhere that has a payphone? Then she could call them." Emily is impressed. "You're right. There should be one by the library. We can stop in there on our way back." Emily leads them some distance away to the city center, toward an old neoclassical building that marks the library, though it isn't an incredibly impressive building. On a street corner, a metal pole sticks out of the ground, topped with a 1912 gray telephone coin-operated pay station. Emily paws Audrey some change from her pocket. "All right, go ahead and call." Staring blankly, Audrey stands in front of the machine. After a moment, she says, I don't remember the phone number. Emily's face betrays frustration, and Esther likewise appears bewildered. Sighing, Emily takes the coins, inserts them into the machine, and puts the receiver to her ear. She speaks to the operator, then gives the receiver to Audrey, who takes it hesitantly, shaking. Several moments pass in awkward silence until Audrey puts the receiver down and looks up to Emily. No one's there. Emily, suspicious and impatient, says, "Let me have it," and she takes the receiver. "Hello?" No one is actually there. Emily gives up and looks down at Audrey. "Is there anyone else you could call?" Audrey looks to Esther guiltily. "No." Emily tiredly rubs her face, then continues, "Okay, we can try again later." Esther, trying to be helpful, says, "Are we still going to the library?" "If you'd like to," says Emily. "I like books," says Esther. "Books are neat," says Audrey. They walk up the steps into the library. There's an orange-stained chandelier hanging in the entryway, and glass displays of miniature ships line the walls. Between the long rows of shelves, several tables and chairs provide reading space, though none are occupied. As Emily, a legitimate book enjoyer, scans the shelves, Esther takes Audrey aside. "What are you doing? You haven't seriously forgotten your phone number, have you? I know you know it." Audrey blushes. "Okay, maybe I lied. But it didn't matter because Emily knew it, and no one was even there after all." "You were still working against your own interests. You said you wanted to go home. Have you changed your mind?" "No, I just don't need her help. And I can see she wants to get rid of me, so it won't hurt to cause her some trouble a while longer." Esther's floored. "What about your parents? And Abigail's waiting for you. You can't seriously mean to put them through more of this for a game." Audrey's tone changes. "As soon as I leave, you'll have to leave too. And you're having fun. Let's just have one more day together." Esther looks touched but not entirely swayed. She snivels a bit, then turns around. "Just until the end of today. But I'm going to call Abigail so she knows you're okay." Esther leaves Audrey and tearfully makes her way through the aisles of bookshelves. Coming out into a clearing, she sees Emily seated in a corner, sunlight from a window above her filtering down in sparkles as the black and white Molly reads. Esther dries her tears as Emily notices her and beckons for Esther to sit beside her. Exhausted, Esther relents, and Emily says, "I know I'm too old for picture books, but I love reading about botany, not because I'm particularly interested in plant biology, but because they always have such detailed illustrations, far better than anything I can make. Then, when I'm out in the forest, I do my best to recognize the plants and flowers from the diagrams, so I can call them by their names and know how they're related to one another. It makes me feel like I'm a part of the ecosystem, or at least that I'm properly able to appreciate how intricate nature is, not as just a backdrop to our own lives." Esther peers over to look at Emily's book, her paws clinging to the side of her chair. Emily gestures to an image of a head of bowing yellow flowers. "This one is called blue bead lily. It mostly grows in the northeast, but it's poisonous to eat. And this is red baneberry, which is more obviously poisonous, but it reminds me of mistletoe." Esther admires the art, brushing up close beside Emily as she continues flipping through the pages. At the same time, Audrey wanders the aisles alone, dragging her claws across the book spines as she passes. Turning a corner, she spots a Tom standing beside a large library cart piled with books, scanning the shelves and returning each book to its proper place. Audrey's heart begins to beat rapidly as she recognizes Homer Bailey. Still focused on his task, Homer continues for several moments until, feeling that he's being watched, he turns around and nearly jumps out of his fur upon beholding Audrey, who peeks out from behind a shelf's end. Initially he says nothing, but, sweeping his gaze around to ensure they're alone, says quietly, "Do you need help?" Audrey stares back, nervous and not sure what to say. After a pause, she starts to speak, but is cut off by the sound of approaching paw steps, and Emily and Esther appear from the shelves. And Emily says, "Audrey, are you ready to go?" Noticing Homer, Emily freezes. Homer, taking note of Esther, awkwardly turns, grabbing a book from the shelf and quickly ducking away. Emily pauses, picking up on the situation, and says to Audrey, "Do you know him?" And Audrey, paws in her pockets, head bowed, blushing, "A little." Emily drops the book she was carrying in the cart, then quickly darts to the end of the aisle after Homer, but finds that he's entirely vanished. Her face betrays a hint of anguish, and she sweats. Esther and Audrey follow close behind, but Emily stops, making a few frustrated cat sounds, and leads them out of the library. Less than an hour later, around 4 p.m., Audrey, Esther, and Emily push through the front door into the parlor of the O'Leary house. Several cats are already present, floating in and around the kitchen, where a formidable plate of food to be prepared sits upon the island counter, rabbit ham, fruit, bread, salmon, among others. Among the cats are Maggie and Billy, the latter of whom prepares yet more food. The cats say nothing as Emily enters, but a few eye her momentarily, and Emily, tired, says, "Maggie, what's all this for?" Maggie blinks, eyeing Emily's group mischievously, and she snickers, "To cook your kit." Audrey freezes, terrified. Esther doesn't look amused, and Emily, actually angry, says, "Maggie, don't act so crude. You're an adult." Maggie, defensive, cackling with her paws up, says, "Don't harm me. I'm just the jester. I'm just a funny little lass." Emily glares at her, and chuckling, Maggie goes on, "It's for the meeting tonight. You haven't forgotten, have you?" Emily looks blank-faced, and Maggie says, "Oh my word, she's even forgotten about book club. How could you forget about book club? You've seemed so very distracted as of late." Emily is embarrassed. "I apologize. I'll still be there." "Of course. But go and get your rest. I know you've been tired, so I went out and bought all this food, with my own money, and I'd better lead tonight too, at least until Florence returns, seeing as you are overburdened at present." Emily is a little suspicious. "You can do as you wish." And Maggie, with a toothy smile, says, "Go on then, get. We're busy here." Peeved, Emily leads Esther and Audrey to a cabinet in the parlor. And Emily sighs, "It'll be loud for quite a while, so you might want to hide upstairs." And opening a cabinet, says, "There's a few board games here to keep you busy." One of the Mollys calls out from the kitchen, "Aw, she's such a good mom." The others laugh, and Emily looks back at them disdainfully, too tired to protest. Audrey stares with shameful, teary eyes. She's not an idiot, and knows quite plainly where the dots are connecting. Emily takes a stack of board games and leads the kits upstairs as the Mollys continue their idle chatter. Emily opens the door to Billy's room and, exhausted, loudly drops the stack on the floor and closes the door, leaving Audrey and Esther inside. Audrey says, trembling and almost crying, "She's not my mother." Esther, surprised, says, "I'm sure they were just being mean." "If she's my mother, then tell her that Louise is dead. Unless—" Esther stops, and Audrey continues, crying and trembling. "I want Louise. She and I are still, even though she was always bigger and stronger, right? She's still my sister, isn't she, Esther? Esther?" Esther puts her arms around Audrey. "Of course. Louise will always be your sister, and she'll always love you and fight for you." Audrey closes her eyes, and Esther releases her grip on her. Audrey says, "Did you call Abigail?" Esther guiltily says, "No, but Mr. Bailey saw us, and I'm sure he'll send word to Abigail and the others." "Get some rest, and I'll do my best to take care of it." Audrey sniffles. "Thank you, Esther. I love you." Esther tucks Audrey into the twin-sized bed she used the night before. That is the end of chapter 22.